There are old stories that haven't been forgotten. They've been erased, not by accident but on purpose, by the hands of kings, generals and scribes who knew that certain events could not survive time without tarnishing the empire's own glory. And among all the truths that the ancient East tried to hide, none is as dark as the fate of the women captured by the Assyrians. A fate so cruel that not even the legends dared to describe it completely. Today, you will walk through the dust of these lands and understand what really happened when the most feared army of antiquity took a city and carried its women away as living spoils of war. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories that time has tried to bury, consider subscribing to the channel. This helps keep alive narratives that would otherwise remain buried under centuries of silence. Now, let me take you to the beginning of it all. The sun hasn't even risen when the first signs of the attack begin to appear. The sky is just a pale strip of grey above the cracked walls, and the wind that crosses the dry fields carries the strong smell of smoke, not of a recent fire, but of announced destruction. The conquered city doesn't scream, it murmurs. There's a strange silence broken by distant sounds like stones rolling or doors being torn from their hinges. It's the sound that always accompanies the arrival of the Assyrians, the army that didn't march to defeat. It marched to dominate. The fine dust rises under each soldier's step. They advance as if the ground already belonged to them, as if nothing there was new to them. The long spears reflect the timid light of dawn, and the pointed helmets create elongated shadows that look like the claws of some gigantic animal. With each street crossed, they leave behind the same trail, marked walls, doors forced open, broken objects, and a silence too heavy for an entire city that, just a few hours before, was still alive. And then you see the first female figures emerge. Not running, not fighting, but being pushed slowly out of the houses. They are mothers, young women, old women, all with their arms raised, some carrying children who cry without understanding what is happening. The soldiers don't shout, don't explain, don't negotiate. They just point and separate. Women on one side, men, the few who survived the initial attack, on the other. And in the middle of this cold and methodical process, you begin to understand that none of this is improvised. It's part of a structure, part of a custom, part of something that is as old as Assyria itself. A young woman tries to hold her mother's hand, but one of the soldiers pulls her arm hard enough to make her stumble. She gets up quickly, even trembling because she knows she can't show weakness. The mother, helpless, watches as her daughter is pushed towards the others. Her eyes fill with tears but remain fixed on the ground, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of shame, perhaps because at that moment any hope seems too heavy. You realize little by little that these women are not just being captured, they are being classified. Quick glances, firm hands, short voice shots between the soldiers. A cruel and silent evaluation. Who seems healthy? Who seems young? Who seems strong enough? Who seems useful? Who seems too vulnerable to survive the journey to Nineveh? Every detail matters. Every movement is observed. Each woman is measured as if she were part of some living inventory that will be transported to distant lands. And as the sun finally breaks on the horizon, illuminating the outline of the destroyed walls, you understand why these stories were never written, because the cruelty that happened there was not seen as brutality. It was seen as part of the natural order of Assyrian conquests. It was the price of victory. It was the fate of those who were on the wrong side of the spear. The hot air begins to circulate among the ruins, raising more dust, and the smell of smoke mixes with the smell of fear. The women are lined up and pushed out of the city under the gaze of soldiers who show no hatred, only obedience. And it is in this mixture of dust, silence, and shuffling steps that the truth begins to reveal itself. For the Assyrians, capturing a city didn't just mean taking its territory, it meant taking its women and deciding their fate, a fate that rarely left survivors unscathed. Before understanding the fate of those women who were pushed out of the city at sunrise, you need to understand who the men who took them were, because nothing that happened later made sense without knowing the nature of the machine that captured them. The Assyrian army was not just numerous, it was designed, trained, and shaped to destroy any form of resistance, physical or emotional. They didn't just fight to conquer territories, but to erase identities, suffocate cultures, and break the will of any people who dared to oppose the throne of Nineveh. And this inevitably included the fate of the surviving women. The Assyrians understood something that few civilizations of the time fully understood. War was not only won on the battlefield, but in what happened afterward. A defeated and destroyed people could reorganize themselves. A psychologically broken people would never rise up in rebellion again. It was this cold and calculated logic that shaped their military behavior, a mentality that transformed each defeated city into a living example, a bloody message sent to the next ones that dared to resist. They advanced as if they were part of a gear. There was no improvisation, there was no hesitation. The formations were so precise that it seemed that each soldier had trained his entire life for that exact moment. And in a way, they had. From a very young age, they were exposed to arduous physical training, endless marches, simulated combat, and practices that today would be seen as psychological torture. All this to ensure that, on the battlefield, there was no room for humanity, only for absolute obedience. Their fame crossed borders long before the first cities fell. Messengers who survived attacks, few and traumatized, spoke of soldiers capable of scaling walls with iron hooks, while archers advanced without retreating even under a rain of arrows. They also spoke of a calculated cruelty that went beyond simple physical brutality. The Assyrians knew when to attack, how to attack, who to spare, and above all, who to capture. And among all the possible targets, women carried a strategic meaning. For the Assyrians, they were not just survivors. They were symbols of victory, of dominion, of power, and above all, of humiliation of the vanquished. When a city knew that the Assyrians were coming, it wasn't just the male population that feared for their lives, the women feared for their destinies. Because the army had the habit of recording, in murals, reliefs, and inscriptions, its main conquests, destroyed cities, defeated kings, taken territories. But about the captured women, almost nothing was said. The silence was no coincidence. It was policy. It was control. The generals commanded each attack with coldness. They knew exactly how to break the physical walls and then break the emotional walls of the survivors. They separated the prisoners according to clear categories, as if they were managing an empire of numbers and not a world of human lives. Young people on one side, children on another, women in a third group, the one that deserved individual evaluation. But there was something even more disturbing. The soldiers didn't choose the women at random. They didn't choose for beauty, nor for fragility. They chose for utility. The Assyrians knew, even before entering the city, what they were looking for. Women capable of working, women capable of serving, women young enough to be shaped by the empire, women who, in their eyes, could still be reused. And it was precisely these that were taken with more care. Not compassion, but calculation. And that's how you begin to understand the cruel logic behind everything. For the Assyrian Empire, each prisoner represented a piece in a larger strategy, a gear in the political machine that sustained the capital. They were not individuals. They were consequences of a victory that needed to be displayed. And this distorted perception, where lives were reduced to functions, is what defines their entire destiny. When the warm air of that morning began to rise over the destroyed streets, the women were already organized in improvised rows. The Assyrian soldiers walked among them in the same way that they would walk among military equipment or shipments of supplies, with precision, with objectivity, and with the certainty that this was part of the natural order of the wars they won. The sun rose slowly on the horizon, illuminating the devastation and projecting long shadows on the prisoners. And in this contrast of light and ruin, it became evident that the fate of those women was not an unexpected consequence of the Assyrian war. It was a fundamental component of its operation. That's how the empire grew, that's how the empire dominated, and that's how entire lives were torn from their own future, even before they began to walk away from home. But understanding who the Assyrians were is not enough to understand the fate of those women. For that, it is necessary to go back to the exact moment of capture, that instant where everything changes, when the war ends for the soldiers, but only begins for the prisoners. The battlefield is already silent, the walls are already broken, the fire has already consumed what it had to consume. It is there, in the hot dust that rises from the destroyed streets, that the process really begins. Not with screams, but with a cold, methodical, almost administrative analysis made by men who had already decided their fate even before entering the city. Separation was always the first step. While the last pockets of combat still died in the background, groups of soldiers roamed the knockdown houses, holding women by the arms, removing them from their improvised hiding places, basements, grain stores, behind heavy curtains, or under structures that partially collapsed. And there was no resistance capable of stopping them, because resistance at that moment no longer meant survival. With each woman found, 2 others were pushed out of their doors, tripping over rubble, trying to keep together the children they carried or supporting older relatives who could barely walk. The soldiers showed no hurry. It wasn't chaos. It was routine. Their faces remained neutral, as if they were evaluating merchandise or inventory. The coldness was so clear that for some women, seeming indifferent was more terrifying than violence, because it meant that nothing they did would change what was about to happen. The first rows were always formed by the youngest. It wasn't a preference, it was an order. They were pulled to the front of the group with quick movements. The soldiers examined their physical condition, posture, resistance to walking, reaction to touch, signs of weakness, signs of illness. Sometimes the look of an officer was enough to define whether a young woman would continue to live or would be left behind. And being left behind under Assyrian rule rarely meant being spared. The middle-aged women were lined up right after. They were useful in other sectors of the empire: domestic work, manufacturing, transportation of cargo. They would be forced to serve in the surroundings of Nineveh or other secondary cities, places where the empire demanded strong hands, but not necessarily young ones. The oldest, these rarely continued in the row. Some were ignored, as if they were invisible. Others were removed from the line and left adrift. Some cried, others just lowered their heads, understanding that their fate would be decided by chance or by the mercy of someone who had no obligation to offer it. Silence was the second step. After the initial separation, the soldiers began to organize the rows with short gestures, pointing, pushing, rearranging. There were no explanations, there were no translations, there were no verbal orders. It was as if any word said there could break an invisible structure that sustained the discipline of that process. The prisoners heard only breaths, steps, the friction of the armor, and the occasional sound of someone falling, whether out of fear or out of exhaustion. Marking was the third step. Some women received small traces made with charcoal on their arms. Others received marks from ropes tied around their wrists, and some were simply positioned in specific groups without receiving any mark, which many times was even worse. The symbols, the markings, and the ropes indicated functions, destinies, logistical needs. But the absence of them indicated something more serious: uselessness, risk, or a condition that the Assyrians had no interest in transporting to Nineveh. A mother, tries to pull her daughter close to her, but one of the soldiers pushes the young woman forward with a firm movement. The mother falls to her knees, but doesn't scream, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of knowing that any reaction could put both in danger. The young woman remains still, with her eyes lowered, and for an instant you realize that for her, the worst thing is not being taken, it's being separated. A few moments later, another young woman tries to hide behind a larger group. She doesn't realize she has been seen until she feels a strong hand hold her shoulder. She freezes. Her body trembles. The soldier doesn't scream, doesn't pull with brutality. He just leads her to the exact point where she should be. For the Assyrians, resistance was irrelevant. The empire had already decided. All that remained for her was to obey. When the sun rises higher, displaying all the devastation of the city, the rows are already organized. Tired women, immobile, dirty with dust and dried tears, await the next step, even without knowing what it is. Children cry in the back of the group. Some young women hug each other, others remain completely alone. And at that moment, even before the walk to Nineveh begins, their fate is almost sealed. Because for the Assyrians, capture was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of something much more cruel, a process where each woman becomes part of a system that doesn't see people, only consequences. Capture marked only the beginning. For many of those women, the real torment began the moment the rows formed and the Assyrian soldiers gave the first silent command to move forward. There was no time for farewells. There was no room for resistance, and if the initial separation had already torn from them almost everything they had, what came next tore away what remained: the breath, the strength, the identity. Because being captured was a terrible fate, but being forced to walk kilometers under the burning sun of Mesopotamia, that was a sentence of survival that few managed to fulfill. The transition between the destruction of the city and the beginning of the walk was always abrupt. The soldiers put the rows in motion with short gestures, nothing more than a touch on the shoulder pad, a light push, or a nod with the chin. They didn't need screams. The discipline was already established. The prisoners, exhausted and emotionally crushed, began to walk because they knew there was no alternative. Wherever they looked, there were spears. Wherever they tried to flee, there were soldiers. There was no possible direction other than the road. The dust rose in dense clouds, covering the skin, the mouth, the hair, entering the eyes until creating a sensation of painful blindness. The feet, still barefoot or with practically destroyed sandals, scraped against stones, dry thorns and broken mud blocks, each step opening wounds that burned with the mixture of sweat and hot earth. The march began slowly, but quickly stabilized. A cruel, rigid rhythm impossible to break. Whoever didn't keep up, fell. Whoever fell was dragged back to the position or left behind. And whoever was left behind rarely got up again. Little by little, what seemed like a walk turned into a silent process of natural selection. The youngest tried to keep up the pace, even with trembling legs. The oldest, when they couldn't bear it, were pushed to the side with the tip of the spear, not with excessive brutality, but with the same coldness with which someone moves an object out of the way. Some tried to get up, supporting themselves on their own hands, but their bodies didn't obey. And the soldier moved on, because the order was not to kill, it was to continue. The landscape around was desolate. Distant mountains that seemed never to get closer, dry fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, and a sun that burned the skin without any pity. With each hour that passed, the heat increased in such a way that some women fainted simply from exhaustion. The sound of the body falling in the dust was muffled, almost mute, and yet it resonated like a cruel reminder for those who were still walking. No one can stop. It was not uncommon to see mothers trying to carry small children, their arms trembling, their bodies faltering. Sometimes they held the children too close to their chests, as if the simple touch could protect them. Other times, they were forced to let go of the small hands that insisted on slipping between their fingers because the walk required both hands free to maintain balance. And when the child couldn't keep up, the fate was as silent as it was inevitable. In the middle of the journey, the soldiers made small pauses, not for rest, for reorganization. They checked who could still walk, who needed to be moved from the group, who had been injured and was starting to delay the formation. And during these pauses, the women remained immobile, with a lost look, heavy breathing, and their bodies bent as if they had aged years in a few hours. Some tried to drink water from shallow puddles left by old rains, but the soldiers pushed them away. The empire's water was rationed, distributed at specific intervals, and only the minimum amount to keep the march alive was provided. Nothing beyond that. Drinking out of order was seen as insubordination and punished with pushes, light blows, or simply a look that reminded them that there was no mercy on that path. As the days passed, because yes, the walk to Nineveh lasted days, something even more disturbing began to happen. The women stopped looking back. The instinct for survival made them fix their eyes ahead, on the ground, on something they could control. The next step, and only that, one step after another, a rhythm that hurt but kept alive the only chance to reach the final destination. And when, in the distance, the gigantic walls of Nineveh finally began to appear, some women cried, not out of relief but out of fear, because the moment arrived when their fate would no longer be in the hands of the road and would pass into the hands of the city. For the Assyrians, the walk was not punishment. It was preparation. It was a test. It was a sieve. And when Nineveh appeared on the horizon, it was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of the judgment. When the monumental walls of Nineveh finally appeared on the horizon, most of the women no longer knew for sure how long they had been walking. The notion of days and nights mixed into a single fatigue that crossed the entire body, an exhaustion so deep that not even fear was able to overcome it completely. But as the city grew before them like a sleeping giant, something changed in the air, an almost imperceptible feeling that the worst had not yet happened. And this feeling, silent and persistent, made some steps become more hesitant, as if the feet were trying to retreat even without permission. The transition from the road to the capital was not sudden, but gradual, as if the empire made a point of preparing the spirit of the prisoners for what was to come. First, the fields cultivated by the Assyrian slaves themselves appeared, vast, organized, with men and women bent under the sun, working in silence, watched by immobile soldiers. Then large deposits of bricks, clay ovens, and small fortifications that spread like scars around the city. Everything there exuded a rigid order, an almost oppressive discipline. It was a world built on control, strength, and fear. And then finally, the walls. High, cold, unbreakable, so wide that two chariots could cross them side by side without touching the edges. When the prisoners passed under the main gate, they felt the air change temperature, colder, heavier, as if the shadow of the city had a life of its own. The sounds also changed. The wind stopped blowing freely, replaced by the distant echo of wheels, hurried steps, pushed animals, and the constant murmur of thousands of people who lived under the Assyrian yoke. For those who arrived there for the first time, it was like entering another world, a world that did not belong to them. The soldiers led the women to an internal square, where other rows of prisoners, from different peoples and different wars, were already waiting. There were tied men, children with empty eyes, elders sitting on the ground with resigned expressions, and, in another corner, a group of women who had already gone through the same walk weeks before. It was impossible not to notice that some of them avoided looking at the newcomers, as if they feared reliving their own arrival. Others watched with a heavy silence, like someone who already knew exactly what would happen next. And then, the cruelest process of all began: the evaluation. The Assyrians treated the selection of the prisoners as they would treat any valuable resource. It was methodical, slow, calculated. Officers walked among the rows with registration boards in their hands, making notes, measuring, observing details that no one else would notice. The strength of the gaze, the posture when standing, the way they reacted to touch, the resistance demonstrated during the march. A young woman who had walked firmly until the end was seen as useful. Another, who trembled with fear when being examined, was noted with symbols that indicated fragility. There was no compassion in that process. There was only function, utility, value. The prisoners were divided into three main groups. The first were the young, strong, healthy women whose appearance pleased the officers. These were sent directly to internal sectors of the city, places where they would serve as assistants, servants, or maids within the residences of influential people. Their lives would be hard, but predictable. The second group were adult women, old enough to work at a fast pace, but not young enough to be taken to the palace. These were directed to the manufactories, weaving, grinding grains, ceramics, clothing production, organizing warehouses. They would work for hours without rest, sleep in collective lodgings, and live under constant surveillance. The third group, however, was the most feared. These were the women who did not fit into any of the others, weak, wounded, traumatized, or simply difficult to predict. These were sent to distant settlements, often in newly conquered regions, where they would be used as labor and at the same time as an element of social control over the local peoples. It was a slow exhaustion, a life with no return. During the evaluation, there was silence, a thick, almost suffocating silence. The women tried to maintain their posture, their eyes lowered, their bodies still. Some cried silently, as if fear itself drained any energy they might have to react. Others remained completely static, as if they had already abandoned themselves even before the final decision. And when the selection ended, the rows reorganized, different paths to different destinations. The city watched from afar, indifferent. For Nineveh, it was just another day, another batch of prisoners, another chapter in the empire's machine. For the women, however, that was the moment they realized something devastating. Surviving the war and surviving the walk did not mean surviving the fate that the city had in store for them, because within Nineveh, every choice made about them ceased to be human and became imperial. For any captured woman, arriving in Nineveh did not mean safety. It meant judgment. The heavy silence of the square, the calculated looks of the officers, the rows reorganized after the evaluation. All of that existed to separate lives, destinies, and functions, as if each prisoner were a piece of a gigantic gear. And before any of them could breathe, the empire had already decided where they would spend the next years, or whether they would survive the next months. Because within Assyria there were no smooth paths. There were only three destinations. And all were cruel in their own way. The transition between the evaluation and the final distribution was almost imperceptible. The soldiers announced nothing, explained nothing. They simply moved the groups with precise movements, directing each row to one side of the square, one to the palace, another to the manufactories, another to the caravans that left for distant regions. And as they walked, the prisoners realized that there was no room for choice. Destiny was a line drawn on the ground, and each would walk it because there was nowhere to run. The first destination was the palace. At first glance, it might seem the least terrible. After all, being inside the inner walls meant shelter, food, and some level of stability. But that impression disappeared the moment the doors closed behind them. The women sent to the palace ceased to exist as individuals. They became useful shadows, trained to serve in absolute silence. They did not speak without permission. They did not rest without orders. They had no future outside those wide corridors whose walls held more secrets than any Assyrian writing could reveal. They served nobles, generals, priests, important visitors. Always watched, always measured. Living in the palace was not living. It was being molded molded until their own identity dissolved within the impeccable routine demanded by the empire. The second destination was the manufactories, and for many, this was the most exhausting path. The women directed to this sector were led to large complexes built outside the city center, where hundreds of prisoners worked as if they were part of a single machine. The weaving never stopped, the constant sound of lines being pulled, threads twisted, wheels turning, stones grinding grains, hammers hitting against clay. All of this formed a melody of continuous suffering. The air was hot, stuffy, filled with the smell of sweat, dust, and burnt oil. They started before dawn and ended late at night, with intervals so short that there was barely time to breathe. The supervisors walked among them with long sticks, not to hurt, but to remind. They rarely needed to use them. The routine itself was punishment enough. And then there was the third destination, the most feared, the most talked about in whispers among the rows, the one that made the heart of some prisoners fail for a moment when they heard the name, the distant settlements. The women sent there did not return. They did not write. They were not mentioned in the records. They disappeared on the edges of the empire. These settlements were located in newly conquered regions or with great internal resistance. There, the women served as labor and simultaneously as an instrument of social control. They built roads, carried supplies, took care of plantations that supplied the army. But the most disturbing aspect was another. They were used as tools to dilute cultural identities, mixing conquered peoples with Assyrian blood and thus weakening future rebellions. There was no constant surveillance because it was not necessary. The isolation was so absolute that even escape offered no hope. Between deserts, mountains, and hostile tribes, fleeing meant dying alone, far from everything and everyone. And yet, there was something that made these three destinations even more cruel. They were permanent. A step defined by the officers in the square, a quick gesture, a symbol noted on the tablet, and a woman's entire life was drawn before her. There was no appeal. There was no second analysis. There was no possibility of exchange. The empire was so vast, so organized, and so cold that any individual voice was lost among its gears. And the women realized this as they walked to their new places within Nineveh. They realized that they were not going to a future. They were going to a function, and the function never freed. The function never forgave. The function never returned what it had taken. Thus, as the sun moved slowly over the city walls, illuminating the beginning of their new lives, each woman, in her own way, understood the same truth. It was not the war that had decided everything. It was the order. It was the machine. It was the empire. And once fitted into it, there was no return. For some women, the destination seemed, at first glance, less cruel. When they were selected to serve in the royal palace, family members or members of their own city might imagine that they would have access to a more stable life, perhaps safer, perhaps less brutal than that faced in the manufactories or distant settlements. But that perception disappeared the moment the inner gates closed behind them. Because within the walls of the palace, cruelty was not blatant. It was not physical. It was not visible. It was silent. And precisely for that reason, it was even more devastating. The transition between the selection square and the interior of the palace was an unspoken rite. The prisoners who would be sent there were separated into a specific group and led through narrow corridors, whose high walls seemed to approach as they walked. Soldiers marched beside them without making any sound. And as they advanced, they realized that for the first time since the capture, they did not hear screams. They did not hear hurried footsteps. They did not hear the chaos of a living city. The palace had another acoustics. A thick, almost ceremonial silence that weighed more than the screams that came from outside. When they crossed the secondary gates, they ceased to be common prisoners to become something else. Assistants, servants, shadow of responsibilities that belonged to people of power. And it was there, in that first contact with the main corridor, a wide corridor where the light filtered through high windows created clear stripes that delineated the floor, that they realized what it really meant to live in the heart of the empire. The palace was not built to receive, it was built to observe. Each door, each column, each niche in the walls seemed to exist to witness without revealing. No step was taken without being noticed by someone. The prisoners quickly learned that there were eyes everywhere, motionless soldiers with spears resting on the ground, old servants who walked in absolute silence, scribes who appeared and disappeared with record tablets in their hands, guards disguised as assistants. It was not necessary to threaten. The constant surveillance was the warning. And then the routine began. The women who served in the palace woke up before dawn, when the light was just a bluish shadow over the corridors. The first sound they heard was the light touch of a wooden rod hitting the stone, a sign that it was time to get up. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need to ask. They walked in line, always in line, led by an older servant who never raised her voice. Not because she was kind, but because discipline eliminated the need. The tasks varied according to the day. Some cleaned endless corridors with rough cloths that scratched the skin. Others carried heavy jars of water that dripped down their arms until their clothes were soaked. Others prepared food, cutting hard roots with worn blades until their fingers were sore. And there were those who served directly in internal rooms, the quietest of all, where nobles, generals, or high officials circulated in low conversations, accompanied by servants and advisors. In these environments, the silence was absolute, and the presence of women was invisible. They moved slowly, always with their heads down, always with soft steps, always avoiding looking directly at any figure of authority. They could not show emotion. They could not react to an order given harshly. They could not hesitate when delivering objects, setting tables, collecting cloaks, or organizing sacred artifacts. The palace did not tolerate personality. It did not tolerate improvisation. It did not tolerate error. And if one of them happened to fail, drop something, delay a task, show too much fear, the punishment was not physical, but social. She was removed from the function and taken to other wings, where she would be isolated for days, performing repetitive tasks that wore down the spirit. There was no visible violence, there were no screams, there were no marks. But the silent exclusion was as painful as any blow, because it meant losing the little stability that had been conquered. The most disturbing thing, however, was not the work. It was the erasure. The women who served in the palace ceased to be recognized as individuals. Their names were rarely recorded. Their faces disappeared into the routine. Their stories were diluted in the structure. Many arrived in the capital with vivid memories of their cities, their families, their fears. But over time, these memories became distant, as if they belonged to another person. The discipline, the silence, and the constant surveillance erased every trace of identity, not all at once, but slowly, like an old drawing being worn away by the wind. And the palace succeeded in this because it was relentless but subtle. In the eyes of the empire, those women were not prisoners, they were tools. And tools have no history, no past, no future. And it is in this habitual silence, in this uninterrupted work, in this invisible presence, that the spectator begins to understand the cruelest side of the Assyrian palace. It did not need to kill to destroy. It was enough to absorb. It was enough to mold. It was enough to transform entire lives into obedient shadows of a power that never rested. But even within the palace, even within a structure that seemed made to erase any fragment of identity, there was something that even the Assyrians could not completely control: the silent resistance. Not a rebellion, not an impossible escape, not an open confrontation, but a resistance made of small, almost invisible gestures that allowed some women to keep alive the part of themselves that the empire was trying to crush. And to understand this hidden side, it is necessary to look beyond the walls, beyond the tasks, and beyond the discipline. It is necessary to see the inner life of those who survived not only the body of the war, but its spirit. The transition between the exhausting routine and these moments of resistance was so subtle that, to a distracted observer, it would seem non-existent. The women served, cleaned, carried, organized, and in the eyes of the palace they were completely absorbed by the function. But there were moments, brief, silent, intentional, where something different happened. An exchange of glances, a movement of the hand, an object left discreetly on a shelf, a gesture that did not change their destiny, but prevented their souls from being completely consumed. For some, the resistance began with memory. Memory of home, memory of mother, memory of a sister who was separated on the day of capture, memory of a field they would never see again. They repeated old words mentally, like prayers that only they knew. Sometimes they murmured names during the early morning, when the palace slept and the silence seemed like a thick cloak covering everything. It was not allowed to speak, but whispering to the dark was not something the guards could hear, and in that whisper, small fragments of the past resisted. Others found strength in bonds created within the palace itself, friendships that were never declared, mutual support that was never seen, solidarity built in silence. An older servant who deliberately left an extra piece of bread for a newcomer, a young woman who shared water during the brief pauses, another who discreetly adjusted the veil or cloak of her companion before entering the presence of an official, so that she would appear more composed, not out of vanity, but because small appearances avoided punishments. And so, without words, an invisible network was born that protected them as much as it could. There were also those who used internal symbols to not get lost. Some made small marks with their nails on the wood of the corridors, marks so discreet that they seemed like scratches from time. Others hid dried seeds, threads of fabric, or fragments of ceramics, objects that had no value to the empire, but that for them were reminders that there was still something of their own in their lives. The resistance was not in the body, it was in the mind. And the mind, when trained by suffering, learned to defend itself even in spaces where there was nothing physical to hold on to. In the lodgings, where they slept on narrow wooden platforms, some women breathed together before sleeping. A simple, automatic habit, but one that created a rhythm, a synchronicity, a sense of community that the empire could never break. It was as if, for a few seconds, the weight of oppression diminished, replaced by a fragile but necessary calm. But perhaps the most powerful form of resistance was observation. The women who survived the longest were those who learned to study the palace, the rhythm of the guards, the pauses of the supervisors, the moments of shadow in the corridors, the sounds that announced shift changes, the way some officials moved. None of this to escape. Escape was impossible, but to live with the least amount of suffering possible. It was the silent intelligence of someone who has already understood that absolute survival depended on anticipating the movement of the empire before it happened. And there was one last type of resistance, the deepest and the most difficult to perceive, the refusal to hate themselves. The Assyrian Empire was so powerful not because it enslaved bodies, but because it tried to enslave minds. It tried to make the prisoners believe that they were useless, disposable, replaceable. But some, even after everything, even after the cut of destiny, refused to carry that lie within themselves. It was not rebellion, it was not naive hope. It was just the will to not allow the empire to decide who they were completely. It was an intimate resistance, almost secret, almost invisible, but it was resistance. And for many, it was what kept their hearts beating. To fully understand the fate of those women, it is not enough to know what they lived through within Assyria. It is necessary to look at what came after. Because when the centuries passed and the empires crumbled, almost everything that could tell their story disappeared. It did not disappear naturally. It was not lost through carelessness. It was erased. It was silenced. It was pushed into the darkness by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. And it is in this part that the truth becomes even more disturbing, because what did not survive says as much as what survived. The transition from their daily lives to historical oblivion did not happen by chance. When modern archaeologists began to excavate ancient Assyrian cities, Nineveh, Assur, Kalhu, they found thousands of records, administrative tablets, celebratory inscriptions, lists of kings, descriptions of battles, decrees on agriculture, taxes, construction of temples and palaces, everything documented with almost obsessive meticulousness. The empire made a point of recording every victory, every conquest, every territorial expansion, and yet, about the captured women, almost nothing. This silence was not an archaeological accident, it was state policy. The Assyrians were masters in the art of propaganda. The walls of the palaces were covered with gigantic reliefs showing triumphant soldiers, defeated enemies, burning cities, columns of prisoners marching with their hands tied. These murals were so detailed that even today it is possible to see expressions on faces, folds of clothes, marks of wounds. But in the scenes where women appear, something strange happens. The details disappear. The faces are simplified. The eyes are mere cavities. The body has no defined contour. They appear only as shadows, as marginal figures, as symbolic elements, never as real people. Some researchers believe that this was not a lack of artistic skill, but a deliberate choice. Clearly recording the faces of the captured women would be giving humanity to them, and giving humanity to them would be recognizing that the empire was destroying lives, not just conquering territories. Assyrian propaganda needed to show strength, not compassion, control, not pain, glory, not trauma. The captured women were part of the victory, but a part that the empire did not want to remember, and then the gaps appear. There are administrative tablets that list quantities of prisoners, but do not specify origin or destination. There are entire murals where columns of men appear clearly, while the women are indistinct blocks on the side. There are letters from governors and generals that mention human loads, without detailing who exactly was part of them. And even more disturbing, there are large gaps in the archives where there should be complete descriptions of certain resettlements. It is as if entire parts of the documentation had been removed, burned, or dispersed over the centuries. Some archaeologists have found broken tablets in unusual patterns, not worn by time, but broken intentionally, as if someone had pressed a sharp tool against the dry clay with force. Others have found scraped inscriptions, where cuneiform signs have been erased line by line. When viewed up close, these scrapings have uniform depth, indicating that they were not caused by natural erosion, but by human hands following a direct order. In these fragments, there is always the same silent question: what were they trying to hide? And the answer, despite never appearing explicitly, begins to take shape through the voids. The Assyrians did not want to record female suffering because female suffering was not seen as part of history. It was seen as a byproduct, something that did not glorify the empire, did not glorify the king, did not serve the narrative of power. And everything that did not serve this narrative was erased. Even so, small traces survived. A fragment of a mural in Kalhu shows a woman with a child in her arms being pushed by a soldier. The child has a sculpted face, but hers has been erased. A tablet from Assur mentions living women taken to the east, living in the feminine. An administrative document cites 3 shipments of women to remote regions. Names do not appear, stories do not appear, faces do not appear, but the vestiges, these remain. And it is they that reveal what official history tried to hide, that those women existed, suffered, resisted, and disappeared within a system that did not want witnesses. In the end, silence does not mean non-existence. It means control, it means erasure, it means fear. And when you put the fragments together, the gaps, the scrapings, the broken tablets, the erased faces, you realize something even deeper. The empire did not fail to record the captured women. It chose not to record them, and ironically, it is this choice that reveals what really happened to them. When you look back at everything these women went through, the capture, the separation, the endless walk, the judgment in Nineveh, the silent servitude, the historical erasure, you realize that the Assyrian war did not only destroy cities, it destroyed memories. It did not only burn walls, it burned stories. It did not only erase enemies, it erased lives. And the most disturbing question is not why this happened, but why no one told these stories with the same intensity with which they celebrated the victories of the empire. The transition between the narrative and the final silence is inevitable. Because when wars end, all that remains are the voices that managed to cross the centuries, and the women captured by the Assyrians had no voice. They had no scribes, they had no recorded stories, they had no right to exist beyond the gaps. They were pushed into an empire so vast that time itself seemed to swallow them, and even so their suffering persists, not in the records, but in the empty spaces between them. When modern archaeologists unearthed broken reliefs and cracked tablets, they found fragments that were not completely erased. These fragments do not show names, but they show fear. They do not show complete faces, but they show raised hands. They do not show detailed stories, but they show interrupted trajectories. It is in these vestiges, in these imperfect traces that survived by accident, that we can feel the echo of what was lost. And it is at this point that the narrative meets something much bigger, the understanding that the worst type of destruction is not the physical, it is the destruction of memory. Because when a woman dies in war, her life ends. But when her story is erased, she dies twice. The women captured by the Assyrians did not have monuments built to remember them. They did not have poems written in their honor. They did not have descendants who could tell what they lived through. Most of them disappeared without leaving even a trace on paper. And that is exactly why their fate is so cruel. Because the cruelty did not end in the body, it continued in history. You realize this when you imagine the silent city after the conquest, the endless march under the sun, the palace that watched everything, the manufactories that consumed every breath, the distant settlements where no one ever returned. None of these places were recorded in detail, but their absence is as revealing as any inscription. What is missing in the tablets is missing because someone decided that it should be missing. And it is this decision that transforms silence into proof. In the end, what survives is not what the empire wanted to preserve. It is what the empire tried to destroy. The shadows in the reliefs, the scraped faces, the erased symbols, all of this makes up a narrative that was never written, but that exists in the cracks, in the marks, in the voids. And by putting these fragments together, you understand that the real story is not in what the Assyrians left to exalt, it is in what they left to hide. And perhaps that is why these women, even after 3 millennia, still touch us so strongly. Because what was hidden by the hands of the empire is being recovered by human memory. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to remember that they existed, and that they suffered, and that they deserve to be remembered. The Assyrian war is over. The cities have fallen. The empires have disappeared. But their silence is still here, waiting for someone who has the courage to listen to it. If this silence touched you, stay with us. There are other stories that time has tried to bury, and that now deserve to be revealed.